on, so.
There's
Is it recording this?
Alright,
There's no way it's
I don't want it.
so let's get started with the discussion, tobacco revolution in Chesapeake. We can go ahead and start talking about the thesis. I'll just throw out one of the theses that I had. So when I found it was the last two sentences of the second paragraph. But even as the great planters, it's the first page. First page, second paragraph, and last two sentences. But even as the great planters installed the new harsh regimen, African slaves and their descendants, sometimes in league with remnants of charter generations, began to reshape black life. In the process, they created a new African American society.
I had my thesis on page 8. It was like in the middle of the page where there's that little gap. And it's enslavement, Africanization, you guys know?
Yeah.
Enslavement, Africanization, the imposition of the new plantation regimen, and the destruction of the charter generations, the various elements of the plantation revolution, altered black life in the Chesapeake region almost always for the worse. But during the fourth decade of the 18th century, black society was again transformed as a new generation of African Americans eclipsed the African majority, ending the era of African domination. So that's what I had, because I felt like it kind of, it's like, I know it's weird because it's in the middle, but I feel like it kind of encompassed the paper as like the passage as a whole.
I found that about kind of, I underlined that, but I didn't actually highlight that as my thesis. The reason I put mine was more, I found that changing continuity throughout the entire paper about how African lives were changed through the process of slavery. So that's why I underlined mine, but I can also see why that one would be considered a thesis.
Yeah.
Joe's thesis and your thesis are one and the same though. It does say altered black life in the Chesapeake region.
The one on page 8 says what yours says, but it like highlights more parts of the passage of the article.
Yeah.
It's more descriptive.
So, yeah, I have my thesis on page 1 on the second paragraph, like last two sentences. What planters restricted the slaves' access to freedom and stripped slaves of their and free blacks of their rights. But even as the great planters installed the new harsh regime, African slaves and their descendants, sometimes in league with remnants of the charter generations, began to reshape black life. In the process, they created a new African American society. So, I mean, it was less descriptive than Joe's, but it's still kind of like outlined, like from the beginning, like African life was enslaved, and then later changed into an African American society, which was, still harsh, but with more leniency.
And it was the same as Hogarth's.
It's
Oh, it was?
a little
Yeah.
Oh, I
added
thought I
part
read
at
the
the
one in the
beginning.
first.
You have a little more than what I
Right.
drew.
Oh, sorry.
Write down names.
Remember to write
Yeah,
down the
so the difference in which sentence we picked isn't the most important thing. Does everyone agree though that the argument that Ira Berlin was trying to explain was just that black life was altered in the Chesapeake region?
And we still need to figure out which is the actual thesis in this.
I don't think
We
we have
don't-
multiple
we've
theses
never-
in a paper. We
they
never
never
like
say the
distinguish
same
one
thing.
thesis
It's
from the other.
It's not very explicit here.
Yeah.
I mean, the one that Alex and I put down, that could be considered a thesis, and Joe's could be just more built up, and that could be just because it's more in the middle of the paper, so he has kind of expanded on his ideas by then, so there may be a reason behind that, why Joe's is more built up than the one on the second paragraph, so.
I had another thesis. It's page 1, first paragraph, last few sentences. It says, in the years that followed, as the number of European servants declined and white farmers migrated west, the great planters turned to Africa for their workforce. During the last decades of the 17th century, the new order began to take shape. A society with slaves gave way to a slave society around the Great Estuary. And I underlined both Joe's and Hogarth's, but I feel like that one, I feel like it's in the right place right at the beginning. And it also talks about the European servants. That's how kind of like the first few paragraphs talks about, so I feel like it kind of gets the whole essay instead of just talking about the African.
I agree with her because I had the same thing, but I think it still also underlines the main point that your guys' thesis has that it changed.
Yeah, I think
That the slave society that developed.
yeah, it's like they're all really together, just different wording and how they're said. Yeah, just like kind of restated different ways.
The point of the thesis, in my opinion, is just to get the whole message of the article and to find the key ideas. So all three of the ones that we've presented work just as fine as they all work fine, so I think we'll get credit no matter what.
Does anyone have a different one than those?
I don't, Trevor, no. Thanks, Trevor, for your input.
Okay, so we can kind of move on into more the body of this article and talk about the origins behind all this slavery. It's kind of where it starts, so anyone have anything to add for that?
Yeah, so right at the beginning, the author starts kind of with the context as to how Europeans and like plantation owners turned to Africans for slaves. On page 1, the third paragraph, right in the middle, it says, but the Native American population was dwindling fast at the end of the 17th century, so Africans became the object of the planters' desire. So because of like the Columbian Exchange and because of expropriation, the Native American population was disappearing in America. So they resorted to like using Africans, which is what led to the rest of the article, just like the context for it.
To go with that, right under Noah's sentence, I just thought it was kind of crazy the amount of like the huge difference in change, where it said white servants had outnumbered black slaves more than 5 to 1, but then by 1700 the balance of bound labor had been reversed. So just to go with Noah, like with the Africans, I think just the change was like huge in how it changed from white servants to now mostly Africans.
And kind of building off of that, we see a lot of these white servants being moved up in society. They're gaining more rights as more Africans are being brought over to the New World. So we can kind of see the level of how, while the whites are gaining their more rights and they're going up in society, they start to oversee the black slaves who are then doing what the white servants used to do. So.
I think something that really adds on to Hobart is on page 7 in the second paragraph, where it talks about how free black people lost the right to employ white indentured servants, hold office, bear arms, muster in the militia, and vote. They were required to pay special taxes, were punished more severely for certain crimes, and were subjected to fines or imprisonment for striking a white person, no matter what the cost. And I think that really adds on to Hobart because it shows that even free black people still had less rights than even the indentured white servants. And that just doesn't really make sense. Since they were the free people, they could own land, they could farm their land. But the white people that were working for other people still had more rights than them, whether it was to vote, they didn't have to pay taxes, or they could hit anyone they want, so.
Yeah, also on page 7 in the first paragraph, it says, only by fixing a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes by excluding them from that great privilege of a freeman, and it says that it's declared from the governor of Virginia in 1723. It's like, they kind of, I feel like they were like looking, because there were more and more of them, they were looking to kind of suppress their like free, like their feelings of freedom in a way, so they would be less likely to like for the slaves to like rise up or like rebel. Also on page 7 and like this back in the last paragraph, it says free people of African descent constituted a small and shrinking share of the black population, probably not more than 5%. So that also shows that like the free black people also like they had like no rights, but there was also very few of them because it was very hard to gain freedom because they had to pay a lot of money that like they couldn't really, they had like no way of getting really. So like there was barely any free black people at all, but they also had horrible rights even if they weren't free.
Yeah, like the indentured servants, in my opinion, I feel like they had like the same, they were in the same social status as the slaves, but because like the white indentured servants were white, and on page 3 it says like their pale skin distinguished them from society's designated mudsill, and so that's kind of saying that like they're in the same social status, but because they're white, they're more respected, more they have more rights than the black people. And so that kind of sets off like the tone of racism in the country.
Going off of that too, it talks about on page 3 also, like about mid-page, talks about in the previous century, maimings, brandings, and beatings had occurred commonly, but the level of violence increased dramatically as planters transformed the society with slaves into a slave society. It really goes off of what yours says about how racist they were towards, even if they were free black people, they still did all that violence and still did anything, but the black people could never retaliate.
So something interesting that I noticed on page 7 was that you could tell with just by reading these laws is that like they tried to limit good people from helping the slaves become free. Like in the first part of paragraph 1 up there, the new regime
What page?
I said 7. The new regime left little room for free blacks, even those descendants of Atlantic Creoles who had enjoyed freedom for generations. Chesapeake planters relied upon white non-slaveholders to serve as overseers and artisans and had no need for black militiamen. Tobacco planters collapsed all black people, free and enslaved, to one subaltern class, in which color, not nationality, skill, or religion defined all. And I saw this as them trying to that the planters were trying to prevent free blacks from helping the slaves. And then also farther down in paragraph 3, in 1691, the Virginia lawmakers transformed manumission into a legislative prerogative and required slaveholders to transport former slaves out of the colony, discouraging the freeing of slaves. So even if you were a white planter and you wanted to free the slaves because you were wanting to be nice to them, you couldn't, or else it'd be like a cost to yourself, and it was a deterrent.
Yeah, I really noticed how all the laws and things implemented have created an anti-black society, and this kind of holding of not, if they're not a slave, they're not desired in the Chesapeake colonies.
What's crazy about that is that like nothing like this has ever happened in society before, that like a cultural difference is like the distinction between whether you're like a good person or a bad person, and that like they totally created this out of nowhere, and that they just pulled this out of nowhere, and it lasted for so long.
This kind of all reminds me of this the Jefferson Declaration assignment we had to do in English. This kind of reminds me of that document we had to read, as in with what Joe said regarding the slaves not being freed and being forced by laws to stay under slavery. It was a risk for both the people, like the slaves, because they're not going to fit in society if they have all these laws there. So there's no way that they're going to even, they probably have a better life in the slavery right now, like in that case, because they're not going to be able to be successful in society because of all the new laws that were imposed.
Oh yeah, so like I think all the like everything you guys are saying about how they created like an anti-black society is because of like what Joe said earlier, that they're trying to suppress them and they're trying to dehumanize them. Oh, you know, back on page 2, like the 3rd paragraph, it says that the first of the among the first of the planters' assaults were the names Africans carried to the New World. So that's like a not like more obvious example of like dehumanizing and trying to take away their identity in order to like suppress them. It took away their names, which also like kind of eliminated the like African culture that came over and showed us.
Yeah, I feel like, so like this isn't like the first time in history I feel like that like the enslaved population has like grown exponentially, and then the controlling like government type population, the free people, like become scared. Like if you look at, like you go back BC, like when the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, as their population began to grow and grow and grow, the Egyptians and like the Pharaoh became like worried that they were gonna like were gonna outnumber the Egyptians and like take over. So they immediately like doubled down and like increased laws against like the slaves, and it's like you look at like in this passage, you can kind of see how they look at the growing slave population as like almost kind of a threat, because it's like as they increase, their strength in numbers technically would increase, and it would probably increase the likelihood of a rebellion.
So like building off of that, it's sort of like how they imported slaves disproportionately of males to females, and sort of like how with the Israelites, they killed the firstborn son to lower their population.
Also with like how they imported more males than females, at a later point they started trying to fix that balance. They started importing more females because they realized that like if they could, if the slaves would have children and like that's an easy way of getting more slaves, cause like they wouldn't have to purchase anymore. So like they started trying to fix that balance.
Another example of dehumanization is on page 3, it's like the first paragraph. It says in 1705 and 1723, new laws required slaves to carry a pass when they left the estate of their owner, even for the most routine business, and denied them the right to meet in groups of more than 4, only for brief periods of time. Even more noble than the legislation itself was the determination of planter control courts to enforce it, as county courts find those planters who allowed their slaves to go abroad. So it's trying to, like, the planter control courts are trying to say, like, that the planters can't, like, let their slaves go anywhere in fear of them, like, escaping or being freed, and they're branded as a slave because they have to now carry a pass everywhere they go. So if somebody, like, sees them away from their plantation and sees their pass, then they'll turn them into, like, the court.
Another example of that would be like of dehumanization on 2, in the middle of the last paragraph. It says, planters made but scant attempt to see that the new arrivals had adequate food, clothing, or shelter, because the open slave trade made new Negroes cheap, and the disease environment in which they were set to work and inflated their mortality rate no matter how they were tended. So basically what it's saying is like, planters didn't care, they didn't give them like much food, clothing, or shelters, just because they knew they could just get new ones easily and they were gonna die anyway. So they were basically treating them as animals almost. There's no, yeah.
And we do see a lot of the changes coming up when we see this new generation of African Americans being born. So there's a lot of changes in these cultures. And
Oh, it's kind of going off like what Joe said with like the Israelites. So later on, African Americans they do get really involved with Christianity and the ideas that come with Christianity, which is actually like from the slaves being liberated from Egypt. They see that and they take inspiration from that, and that gives them more of a reason to have an uprising or resistance against their owners. So
It also goes back to our thesis, when we were summarizing that, basically, the way African slaves were treated, led to like this culture. So the mixture of Christianity and like European American customs with the African customs and culture, like created a new like society.
I thought it was interesting how like the runaways like tried to form their own societies based on the centers of like their like traditional African customs, because of how like they were all stripped from them when they arrived. So I thought it was interesting how they tried to keep it alive, but even though they were caught.
To go off the change that Hobart talked about, on page 11, about in the second paragraph, about halfway through, it says, the free Sunday had become an entitlement rather than a privilege. So almost all Chesapeake slaves had Sundays to themselves. It kind of shows that the mindset in the colonies were shifting over time as slaves, as African Americans were able to speak English, they understood the culture and they knew what was going on in the region. They could develop a bit of a more relationship with their planters, and I think that helped lead to them getting more rights, not more rights, but more privileges and making conditions a little bit better than they were in the past.
And also on page 11, it said that the slaves, on like the second paragraph, said that the slaves were like they're knowledgeable about like farming and all that stuff, just like their owners. And so it says, as knowledgeable agriculturalists, these men and women appreciated how their strategic interventions could destroy season's crop and ruin their owners. So this kind of says that the slaves can have power against their owner because they're smart enough to actually ruin the crops and and they know the system of how everything works. So that kind of gives like, reasons for resistance and all that. So
I think a good sentence that like sums Shell and Ramirez's point up is on page 11 at the bottom of the third full paragraph. It says the maturation of tobacco culture did not end the contest between master and slave. It only moved the struggle to a new ground. So that kind of sums up that like times are changing, but like that these slaves are still slaves, and it's just moving like to a new problem. So.
To me, it seemed like they had won like a battle here by gaining some more of their rights back, but they were still had a long way to go for the war against for their freedom. And then, so what else? Anyone else have something they want to bring up?
Yeah, are we supposed to, are we just supposed to kind of mention things we like? Or, and I'm being like serious, or are we supposed to like relate these to like explain how we back the thesis?
Related to these.
Because right now it just kind of, it just really seems like we're just kind of saying a random point.
Does anyone have like any
What we liked.
questions? Anyone have any questions?
Way to interrupt them, Howard.
It's okay, let's
It's not
continue.
your
Okay, but I think it's just both something that you either can relate back to the thesis, or something that you like, kind of like can talk about, what you know, stuff. Whatever you desire to talk about.
Sort of like a change in continuity over time. Like there were multiple changes, such as in the first place they were really suppressed, and then over time they got less suppressed and less suppressed. But continuity would be that they were still enslaved throughout that whole time.
I feel like, how it says on page 8 in the thesis that I chose, it says, but during the fourth decade of the 18th century, black society was again transformed as a new generation of African Americans eclipsed the African majority, ending the era of African domination. So like, and then as I kept reading after that, I kind of noticed that like, as the newer slaves that were like born in America, they were kind of native to America, I guess you could say. Black, that would be correct. But as they grew up in America, in the U.S., or the colonies, sorry, they kind of were around that, a different environment than they would have, like, technically been around, like their life in Africa would have been different. So as they were, like, here in the U.S., they kind of adopted certain parts of American or colonial society, and use that American, but colonial society, and it kind of, as they kind of adapted, they kind of changed, and it like, I feel like it kind of caused like the white people or like to the planters to like value them just a little bit more and like allow them a little bit more rights because of like the adaptation, and like how it says they were like allowed to like talk about their own like religion, like it says on page 12. They understood that the new religion recognized the spark of divinity in every man and woman, and it kind of like how they allowed the slaves to be more open and free and like, talk about religion with them is like they let the slaves join in with them, and so that kind of like spurred the increase of rights. Not obviously not even like close to freedom, but like spurred them into gaining just like little rights here and there. So that kind of goes along with the thesis of the new generation coming up and as the new generation comes up, they adapt and they take in new things from the colonial society and kind of,
Throughout page,
5 minutes.
I just agree.
throughout page 10, it also agrees with a ton of things Joe just mentioned. And like the second and third the second full and third full paragraph, it says, throughout it, it says slaves established other conventions to provide them with a modicum of domestic stability, and then it says few slaves named their children after the plantation's putative father and mother. A system of inheritance emerged, domestics passed their skills and special positions within the plantation to their children. slaves also won a measure of privacy with their domestic lives. These are all things that didn't happen in the years before, but like Joe said, over time, it kind of adapted to these and became more, I guess, more lenient to these slaves.
That's a good word.
Do you
I
guys
really like the quote where they talk about how the bellied were forced to work in the fields.
Why do you like the quote?
Dehumanization, like,
Wait, where is that?
Where's that?
you're not.
What? Okay. I was gonna say, do you guys think like the changes that the planters made to the slaves' rights, do you think that was just for profit or just out of like?
I feel like it was kind of both because it's kind of like the idea that like this is kind of cheesy, but like a happier work environment means better work. I mean, kind of, but I feel like it was also they started to be more lenient because of the as the slaves joined their religion, kind of I feel like they kind of just liked the slaves more because of it.
You think it could be like, there's just like an idea, but do you think it played a part that like, say these two generations, both kids of like the slaves and the kids, like children of the plantation owners, like since they were raised, I don't want to say raised together, but like in the same environment as children, think that could play a part?
I think what Dave was trying to say is like all this stuff is like, why is it important? Like, why did it have effect on the thesis, not just like what happened?
So something that I noticed with the changes is that for the first African slaves that were imported, the planters were more trying to break their will, to make them more into a subservient state. And then as the generation started to become more like them, they had realized that they had broken them away from their own culture, causing them to change into being more like them, which made them more likable to the planters themselves.
I feel like it was more that they realized that the slaves were gaining more power in their knowledge of the crops, like what was mentioned on page 11, that like they had power, or you could say they had some sort of powers that, so the slave owners had to recognize that, and they had to like give them little things so that they didn't ruin a crop for a whole season, and that they didn't all revolt at the same time, that they could keep them somewhat happy so that they didn't feel the need to revolt.
It would be more of a willingness to work.
Yeah.
I have a question. So, why do you think it took so long for the slaves to actually become free in like mid-1800s?
They didn't have any resources to be able to get free. Most of them weren't educated enough to like pursue any like claims within like court or like enough money to support those claims. And also they had no weapons if they wanted to try to do it forcefully. So the slave owners had like guns. They were revolt, they could always just shut it down quickly.
Yeah, and also as a mentality, like, bad example, but similar, it's like, why did a lot of guys go to CBC, right? Your dad went to CBC and his dad went to CBC. So when you're born into a slave society where the only thing your family's ever known is slavery, it's kind of hard to try to break free from that. And that's why I think it took so long, because in the days of, not necessarily the charter slaves, but in the mid one, not the new African Americans, but when it was still just Africans, any way that you tried to revolt, you would instantly either be brutally harmed or killed. So, I mean, it was a mentality that if I try to escape, if I try to break free, I know I'm gonna die for a fact, because there was nowhere to go really.
Yeah.
Yeah, we need to kind of wrap things up.
Yeah,
Okay.
so-
Like, less than a minute.
Let's just make sure, Jack Harrington hasn't came back in since, do we wanna check on him and see if,
Yeah.
he has anything to say or just
Everybody has a problem.
Is everybody, did you write down everybody?
Yes, so I have, myself, Joe Murphy, Alex Ramirez, Gabe Pedada, Jack Hercules, Nick Kinnison, Alex Ford, Trevor May, Kevin McGill, Miles French, Alex Robinson, Jake Cole, Andrew Muth, Eddie Nowak, and Jake Michelle. Is that
Everyone
everyone?
was not called, speak now, grab a phone.
Yes.
conversation.
we're getting married. Thanks, good.
So, I didn't see any, does anyone have any questions that we didn't get to answer? Cause I can write those down on the back of this note card. I didn't see any, like, I didn't hear of any.
He's like halfway through.
He's halfway through, well,
Well, tell him to say something that he
Well,
don't.
Does he
It
have
says,
any-
it says on here,
It says if they don't have it done, they're gonna do a
Yeah, they have to
conversation
make
with
it
them.
up with them
yeah,
later,
so I have to put him as non-participant.
So.
Okay, does everyone understand the thesis, like how the chain of continuity?
Yes.
And our time is up.
What?
Yeah, we have like 5
Yeah,
minutes.
like, they all relate to each other, basically.
Yep, I like how we agreed on
Oh,
one thing.
Alright,
Pretty good.
so
All right.
I'll go ahead and collect everyone's, make sure you have your name on both the submission